Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those joining us from around the world. My name is Reva Dingra, and I'm the postdoctoral research fellow for the Foreign Policy Program here at the Brookings Institution, and I'll be the moderator for this discussion. On behalf of the Center for the United States and Europe and Brookings, it is an honor to welcome you all to this important event to discuss the future of asylum policy in Europe and lessons from European cities and municipalities' experiences with Ukrainian refugees in building a new asylum architecture for both Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has forced over 13 million people to leave their homes and relocate within the country and abroad in search of safety. The European continent and the world more broadly has not seen such a level of displacement in both speed and scale since the Second World War. Nearly 6 million refugees from Ukraine have fled to Europe, and another estimated 5.1 million Ukrainians remain internally displaced within the country as of June 2023. European countries have faced real challenges at the state and municipal levels to find accommodation for Ukrainian refugees and provide appropriate social and educational services. With no end to the war in sight, the future remains highly uncertain for Ukrainians living in displacement. At the same time, the European Union's response in the form of the Temporary Protection Directive, granting Ukrainians the right to reside in member states and access housing, employment, and social protections, appears to have been remarkably effective in facilitating Ukrainian inclusion. While the shock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the refugee crisis dominated public discussions last year, Europe also saw near record numbers of non-Ukrainian asylum applications, which includes from individuals already present in the EU, as well as new arrivals. Across the EU plus countries, including Norway and Switzerland, almost 1 million people applied for international protection in 2022, which is an increase of over 50% compared to 2021 and the highest since 2016. New arrivals of non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and migrants by land and sea have also increased, though still paling in comparison to 2015 and 2016. These trends are reflective of worsening global displacement. As years-long conflicts continue, new violence spreads, and more communities face the devastating effects of economic collapse and climate change, the number of displaced people worldwide now exceeds 110 million. Thousands have and will continue to risk their lives on treacherous journeys to Europe. 2 weeks ago, over 500 asylum seekers and migrants were estimated to have lost their lives in the central Mediterranean, the deadliest disaster in years. And just this past weekend, flights out of Moscow were selling out as the Wagner Group inched closer to the capital, raising fears of a surge in Russians seeking asylum, even as neighboring countries keep their borders firmly closed to Russian citizens, many neighboring countries. The current situation has highlighted a sharp disparity in treatment of Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers and the ongoing local challenges facing European communities in responding to displaced population needs. European policymakers have for years struggled to craft a unified asylum and responsibility sharing framework, and 2 weeks ago, the Council of the European Union announced a new agreement on asylum and migration management, which includes expanded border detention centers and a procedure for relocating migrants and asylum seekers within the EU. As policymakers grapple with how to respond to growing displacement, our distinguished speakers here today offer insights to inform these discussions based on decades of experience working on refugee, migration, and local response issues in Europe and more broadly. I'll give a few introductions before turning to the panel. I'd also like to acknowledge Brookings CUSC's research assistant, Sophie Rosa, for her tireless work researching this topic and co-organizing this event. We are first joined by Christine Goye, currently the Deputy Representative for the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, in Poland. Ms. Goye has worked with the UNHCR for 20 years, including in Ukraine, Turkey, and other countries, and has been with UNHCR Poland since 2018. We are joined as well by Dr. Petra Bendel, Professor of Political Science and the Head of Research on Migration, Displacement, and Integration at Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. Dr. Bendel is an expert in refugee migration and integration issues at the local level in Germany and in many other contexts. Our next speaker is Mark Elksnot, who is the head of unit of the Office of the Chief Executive, of the German Association of Cities and Municipalities. Mr. Elsner is also a member of the Evaluation Commission of Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in Germany. Our final speaker is Dr. Kemal Qureshi, a senior non-resident fellow and the previous director of the Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Qureshi has worked on asylum and refugee and migration issues for years and also wrote an article earlier this year on the Ukraine response. Finally, before we begin, this panel discussion is on the record. Please feel free to send your questions into events@brookings.edu and use the hashtag AsylumEurope. So it's hashtag AsylumEurope, one word, on Twitter to tweet about the event or share questions for our panelists. And now turning to our panelists, Ms. Goyer, we'll start with you. Can you tell us about the current status of arrivals and asylum applications from Ukrainians in Poland, and how has UNHCR adapted its response over the past year and a half?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'll start maybe with the global figures on arrivals of Ukrainian refugees since 24 February 2022, and with the latest data that is available as of 19th of June, so a week ago. So there's up to 5,958,000 Ukrainian refugees recorded in Europe. So that's not EU, that's Europe specifically. So that's a bit broader than the EU context. And that includes those granted temporary protection, those granted refugee status, those granted different forms of protection statuses. In Poland, there is up to 1,600,000 Ukrainians who have been recorded since 24 February 2022 and have been granted temporary protection in Poland, out of which around 1 million now have active status. So it's a big number of refugees, in addition to a pre-existing large Ukrainian diaspora that was already in Poland before the war started, under different form of statuses, mainly through work permits, for instance, students' visa, and a few a bit less in terms of numbers of Ukrainians who had been granted refugee status or different forms of protection. So obviously, this is a very big number that Poland had to deal with from the early days of the crisis. And I think for sure, as you mentioned in introduction, the fact that the EU very early on decided to trigger the temporary protection regime was a game changer, because it came very quickly and it did provide very high levels of protection and rights to refugees coming from Ukraine, including, and that applies to Poland as early as 6th of March already had taken national legislation to transpose the temporary protection directive, and has in some areas given even more rights, or has exceeded a little bit the level of protection anticipated from the temporary protection directive. So that was quite instrumental to make sure that the conditions were set for a good response. But that alone, of course, doesn't do it all. I think this response showed us, and when there is capacity, but also very strong political will at the national level, but also in this case at the EU level, it does make a difference in the way refugees are welcome and are very quickly given tools and access to rights to be integrated very quickly. The last point I'd like to mention in this equation that we have seen in Poland is really a whole of society approach, in the sense that, yes, the government took the EU level, and then the government took very important normative approaches, kept the borders open, which was crucial in the context of the war in Ukraine. But also there was a huge solidarity movement from every single citizen of this country who decided to be part of the solution, to be part of the response. So I think the putting together all these elements, and of course, a pre-existing very active civil societies, NGOs who had some experience already working with refugees and more broadly migrants was quite instrumental. And finally, as the UN Refugee Agency, we had been in the country for 30 years, obviously in a very different role as you know, nobody had really expected such a mass influx. But it helped us, but we had to become operational very quickly and to have programs that would be complementing what was already made available by the government. So overall, it's been quite extraordinary to witness this equation, I would say, political will and capacities on the ground to respond. And so it means that when this is put together, the EU and Europe can really respond well to such a crisis.
Yeah, Ms. Goy, thank you for highlighting the solidarity approach and the role of political will in this. Dr. Karishi, I want to turn to you. What about non-Ukrainian asylum seekers? So, we've seen a number of news headlines on recent increases in sea arrivals. So could you talk us through a little bit about this trend?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. As you pointed out in your introductory remarks, the number of asylum seekers coming to the European Union, as well as beyond, as Christine Goyer has mentioned, Europe at large, is a trend that came immediately on the heels of the end of the COVID pandemic. And beyond the Ukrainians, those who are streaming towards Europe and the European Union are primarily Syrians. Syrians had rushed to Europe during the 2015 and 16, what was called then as the European migration crisis in a very different context. The problem had actually started in 2011 and 12. But there had been a sudden surge of about 1.2 million Syrians and some other nationalities making their way to the European Union on foot. In brackets, on that occasion, the Temporary Protection Directive was not invoked, but we might come to it later on in the discussion. Syrians, hand in hand, are followed with Afghans, as I'm sure you're all aware, and those who are following this panel are aware. The major change in regime and the arrival of the Taliban in Afghanistan has precipitated a major displacement into the region. And from the region around Afghanistan, there's been a movement, a continuous movement into the European Union. Iraqis used to arrive as well, but there's been some dipping, a fall in the number of Iraqis arriving. But there is also, as the disaster you referred to 2 weeks ago has demonstrated, there's a mixed population of irregular as well migrants as well as asylum seekers that come from Africa and beyond Africa, from Asia as well. And the directive, the council decisions you have made reference to is also an effort towards distinguishing between them, the ones who will be entitled to international protection and those who would be considered as not entitled to that kind of protection and has to be returned. An issue we'll come back to. In Africa, there was the crisis in Sudan that was preceded by those ongoing crises in Somalia. The Ethiopian situation had been resolved. There is still pockets of instability and conflict in Africa. You mentioned the situation in Russia. I couldn't help but consider what will happen, for example, in Mali, where the Wagner group had been active, and we've seen asylum seekers arriving to Europe, the European Union, from Mali as well. And lastly, especially when we take into consideration Spain, we do also see asylum seekers making their way from Central America, for example, for Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua have also been arriving to the European Union.
Yeah, and I mean, this is really highlighting the global nature of the challenge that that Europe and much of the world is facing in terms of a rise in global displacement. So, Dr. Bendel, we talked a bit about the temporary protection directive, and Ms. Goye mentioned the temporary protection directive put in place for Ukrainians. And because we're, in this event, we really want to focus on the nitty-gritty of policies put in place to welcome asylum seekers or facilitate local access to services. Could you talk us through a bit more on what the measures put in place by national governments in Europe mean for Ukrainian asylum seekers? And I'd also love to hear if you see there's a big difference in legal frameworks for Ukrainians and non-Ukrainian asylum seekers.
Yeah, there is. Thank you, Reva, for inviting me, and happy to be here just discussing with you all. First of all, I would agree with Christine, who said that the temporary protection directive was really a game changer. It actually had been in place since 2001, and it had never been triggered, simply because there was no political will to do so. But in this case, it was really something what can be called historic, actually, because the directive and its implementation in the member states, in the European member states, in national law, allow protection to be granted quickly and mainly unbureaucratically in principle. And people can be integrated into the labor market very quickly. For instance, they have direct access to labor. They have direct, if they are recognized in what they bring with them in terms of education and labor experience. This is still an important point also to say. And Ukrainians can also, in principle, choose their place of residence. Other asylum seekers normally cannot, and they register at least in Germany, only when they seek access to benefits here. So if they want to get benefits on the ground, they don't had to register right at the beginning. So at the beginning, we didn't even know how many people were there. And unlike other refugees, they are not registered centrally and then distributed accordingly to the Bundesländer in German. In Germany, we have a distribution key, which is called, for those of you who know German, the Königstein key, which normally distributes the number of a percentage of refugees to the subnational level, to the Länder, according to their population and the economic strength. And the freedom of choice that the Ukrainians have offers them, of course, a considerable advantage, because they can use their existing networks of Ukrainians, of maybe also friends they know from other places. Only for those who don't get access directly via their networks and get accommodation privately, there's also the possibility still to be distributed to the municipalities through a key. And I also in Germany, I would underline that the support from civil society was really key. Because the municipalities, as Mark certainly will say, wouldn't have managed that alone. This was only possible with the many people from civil societies who supported them. And now, coming to the empirical point, integration is actually taking place. We have a very huge representative study already, which was published some months ago, among 11,000 Ukrainians. And this is important because there we see that the intentions to stay in Germany, this is German-based, vary a lot. Like 34% say they want to leave Germany after the war. And more or less 1/3 also says they want to stay in Germany, and another 17% would like to stay several years or shorter. So, and several others cannot make a statement yet, of course, because we don't know what will be happening. And and the empirical data also shows that that integration is taking place rapidly. Like 3/4 are housed in private apartments, and only 9% in shared accommodations. And then many have already attended a German course, like 51%. 22% of the children are already in daycare centers and 60% in kindergartens. And 90% of the school-age children are already in the schools, attending schools. And the employment rates are slowly but rising. Like we have 18% of the Ukrainians who have already found a job. So yes, I think this is a very helpful direction for the rapid integration also on the ground. And of course, as you asked for unequal treatment, of course we have discussions now about unequal treatments, because asylum seekers have to stay, depending on where they are in the country, but they have to stay in common accommodation centers. Sometimes they have a long asylum procedure, which Ukrainians simply could skip. On the other hand, once they are recognized as refugees, they can stay for a long period, and Ukrainians just have a temporary protection, which is normally 2 years, and mostly in Germany now they say it's 3 years. So it's unequal treatment on the one hand. On the other hand, Ukrainians are not guaranteed refugee rights on the long term. So let's leave it at that. There's a lot of discussion about unequal treatment also in the municipalities. Local authorities tell us a lot about these unrest among asylum seekers and refugees also.
Yeah, and Dr. Bendel, that's a really great transition point to Mr. Elksnat. I'd love to ask you about exactly this question. What are we seeing at the municipal level and the local level in terms of the main challenges, facing cities and towns? And could you talk a little bit about this point that Dr. Bendel mentioned in the way these different legal frameworks for refugees and asylum seekers are playing out?
Yes, of course, I can. Thank you, Riva, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Let me maybe start with a few numbers. Cities and municipalities in Germany in the last year took in over 1 million people from Ukraine and 210,000 asylum seekers. So 1.2 million people. We had to organize the accommodation for a starting integration process. And like Petra and Christine said, it wouldn't be possible without a great solidarity movement from the people or we had in our citizenship. These numbers I just said means 1.2 million people. This is comparable to an additional large city in the size between Cologne and Munich, which are the third and fourth largest cities in Germany. So how are we working and going, or what is our goal to really tackle this issue as cities and municipalities? For the most part, and together with federal states, we are working on it to have accommodation decentralized in more than 10,000 cities and municipalities. The aim is to have private housing for people from Ukraine, not for people that are, like Petra said, in asylum procedures. We are estimating for 2023 around 300,000 new asylum seekers. The numbers for people from Ukraine are pretty solid, I would say. There are a lot, like 25 to 30,000 people leaving Germany every month, but there are also people coming back to Germany. So the number of 1 million people is pretty on a pretty constant level. So what are the big challenges for the local level? And in Germany, the biggest challenge we face, I would say, is having the appropriate accommodation for people from Ukraine, but also for refugees, since we don't have, or it's not possible just to use every free accommodation. We have to have accommodations where you can start the process of integration. Like, for example, you need accommodation close to schools, kindergartens, daycare, when you have families with kids, for example. You can't just have empty living space and put them there. Just not our goal to just have an accommodation, but we want to start integration. And that's a goal we have with our cities and municipalities in the most part. You asked for the temporary protection. It was really a game changer because we don't had to have the asylum process for the Ukrainians. It honestly wouldn't have been possible to have a procedure, a fast procedure for the number of people coming in such a short time. It just wouldn't be possible with our regulations. So that is a big relief actually for the cities and municipalities. And was a big relief. Just let me put out one more fact for the biggest challenge you asked me for, to put the numbers I said into context. In Germany, altogether, we have Ukrainians and asylum seekers state of 31st December 2022, around or almost 3 million people. 2.5 million asylum seekers and people from Ukraine, 2.5 million people from Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Russia, and the Western Balkans alone, and 445,000 around, like Kamal said, from other states and regions of the world. So 3 million people to have accommodation, integration, that's a big challenge to organize, and also to organize it with different nationalities, different culture. And that's why the unequal treatment we have for Ukrainians may be justified if you look at maybe cultural background and how easy or comparable easy it is to start the integration process compared to other regions or other cultures we see. And that's also something we are hearing from the cities and municipalities. I think I will leave us with that. I could also go into detail to benefit system, but that's a German problem.
Yeah, and on that last point, I'd love to hear from your research and what you all are seeing on, how much can we disentangle these cultural factors from the legal frameworks that have been put in place. And I'd like to turn now to how this Ukraine response can shape our thinking around an asylum policy in Europe. And, a couple weeks ago, the Council of the European Union announced an agreement, as I mentioned in the introduction, on reforms to migration and asylum approaches, which will be discussed again later this month and may become rule later next year. And Dr. Krisha, I want to ask you about this question, given your expertise on refugee issues, both within the EU and in other countries. So do we see this as a step towards a unified asylum framework? Do we see this as integrating, lessons from the Ukrainian response, or is this, another situation of a parallel rule system for Ukrainians and non-Ukrainians?
Mm-hmm. I think I need to start by saying that what makes the European Union is the so-called four freedoms: the free movement of goods, services, labor, and people. So what we have seen 2 weeks ago is a product of an ongoing, very difficult process of trying to create a common European asylum system, as it is called. But it also comes as part and parcel of an effort to harmonize the practices of EU member countries, not just on asylum, but also on migration, aspects of migration, irregular migration, as well as regular migration, plus the control of the European Union's external borders to ensure free movement of people within the European Union. I think it was familiarized as the Schengen area, Schengen free movement area. You need to make sure that your external borders are well managed. The idea of reforming what has been put into place since the mid-1990s came up with the current legislative period that started in 2019. In September 2020, before the Ukrainian crisis had erupted, the European Commission, the executive arm of the European Union, came up with a proposal. And what is happening is that proposal is, if you wish, being processed. It's going through a decision-making process. And a significant development occurred in mid-June when, as you pointed out, the European Council, that is the body that is representing member states, were able to agree on two aspects of this reform process. One is the regulation that it will govern. It has not been adopted yet, as you've pointed out. It has to go through the European Parliament as well. And hopefully before this legislative period ends next year in the spring, it will be adopted. What it does is it puts into place common rules and regulations to manage asylum applications and the rights of those asylum applicants while their application is being processed. And it concerns mostly countries on the edges of the European Union, external borders. Maybe very quickly, time is very limited. What these two developments that took place or steps that were taken 2 weeks ago is product of an effort to address two tensions or challenges within the European Union. That is, the complaints coming from countries on the external border of the European Union that is taking asylum applicants, but also receiving mixed populations, as I pointed out, and they have to sort out those that deserve international protection and those that need to be sent back. They demand greater solidarity in the process of going through this. But the countries inside the European Union, and Mark will correct me, and Petra if I'm wrong, most of them are trying to head to Germany. They complain that the countries that are in the external border, on the external borders of the European Union, are not doing a vigilant enough effort, because a lot of these people are getting picked up inside the European Union. For example, the Chancellor of Germany not that long ago complained that almost 80% of people who are getting picked up in Germany are people who are coming from the external border, not necessarily from inside Germany. That is those people who've run up. So that's and the critical aspect of that meeting was that these tensions were resolved to a certain degree. That is, the countries in the external border of the European Union, like Greece, Italy, Spain, Malta, Cyprus, are going to the regulation, if adopted, is going to ensure a more precipitous processing of applications that are questionable. And the regulation has the details. It's 140 or 50 pages long. The proposal has the details of how to deal this. And the other side of the medallion is that there will be a possibility to relocate some of these people to countries inside the European Union. And there the tension was that East European countries like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia were very reluctant to do this. And the European Commission, in its usual skill, managed to find an arrangement where these countries will have the possibility to financially contribute to the countries at the external border, or administratively by providing resources in the form of staff and other possibilities. Riva, I realize time is limited. Maybe I should stop here, but I personally would consider this as an important breakthrough. But don't count your chicken before they hatch, because the European Parliament has to be brought on board. And there are complaints that what this is going to do is that make the European Union an even greater fortress than it used to be. It has been so far.
Yeah, and this deal has been, heavily criticized by a number of rights groups, but it's also receiving criticism, from countries such as Poland and Hungary. So, Dr. Bendel, I want to ask, from a practical perspective, do you see these new policies coming out as integrating some of the lessons that we've learned from the Ukraine response? Could there be more done here? And how do you see this shaping integration at the local level, as based on your expertise on this?
Maybe I can say 3 sentences about the agreement that we've seen 2 weeks ago, because I'm really, really concerned about that. Not only as a human rights activist, but also as a researcher, because in political terms, I think I'm really concerned about the human rights aspect there. It's particularly worrying with regard to procedures being held at the European borders and how you control human rights standards there, and particularly with regard to children's rights. And then there's also practically no monitoring, or monitoring is left to the member states alone. So ask Greece if it is violating human rights. They will tell you no, obviously we're not. We are strictly monitoring it. I'm just a bit cynical on that, but. And with regard to the Ukrainian situation and the temporary protection directive, I think that, as we said right at the beginning, in political terms, it's really a historical situation, but it's also unique. And we haven't seen that, for instance, Poland and Hungary, who have been willing to accept Ukrainians fleeing from the civil war, from the aggressive war, to their countries, they haven't united their forces with other member states at the borders, as Kemal rightly said, who are being more overwhelmed than others by the situation, because they are right at the borders. They even have right now, they also have to do the asylum proceedings, etc. But there has not been any solidarity. It has remained a unique common political will, as you maybe would say, Christine. That's what you framed it like in the beginning. Secondly, it's important to see how what are the consequences of free choice, because Ukrainians, as we said, had free choice. They weren't sent to being distributed in certain areas, nor to certain member states. So this, of course, while it is very important for the individuals, it hasn't definitely led to a more equal distribution. Right on the contrary, we have, of course, people, and this is what migration is like normally, we go where we have networks. So people in the member states have concentrated in certain member states at the eastern borders, some also in Germany, because they did have networks already. So in view of the large numbers of Ukrainians, it would have been, I think, preferable to have a certain burden sharing. I won't call refugees a burden, but member states call it like that. So it's a quote, please. So to relieve the burden of the initial reception in Central and Eastern Europe, and to ensure that people who are coming also have the best possibilities to access to health services, to accommodation, to the labor market, to education, etc. And even the temporary protection directive would have allowed to do pledges, to name quotas. It hasn't been done, because a mandatory quota triggers negative reflections in certain member states. So I think what we should do, while we should remain, we should leave to a certain point the possibility of free choice, because it is really helpful for the individuals and for the families and networks. However, member states could have, who have taken in comparatively few refugees, could quantify minimum quota for refugee intake according to their economic capacity, for instance, or provide other assistance. And third, in the near future, I think what we should make use of matching procedures. Mm-hmm. Matching procedures could be very useful to bring together member states willing to take refugees and the local communities. And here you get back to Mark, to the municipalities, because just to give you an example, my team at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, together with several partners and 4 federal states in Germany, we have already developed an algorithm which is based on the findings of migration and integration research. It's called Match-In, if you want to look it up. It's also available in English. I can post this in the chat afterwards. And this it records individual aspects of the protection seekers on the one hand, and match them with the possibilities that municipalities have, and match them with those municipalities that best match to their needs. So I think this could also be scaled up if we're good at it, because we're right now piloting during the summer, the European summer. We are piloting this project, and we are distributing refugees according to the algorithm, and we are following that scientifically. And if we can show that this is really a good way to distribute more fairly and more individually, maybe this could also be scaled up on a national and also on an EU level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for that. We also have a number of questions from the audience, and I just want to make sure I turn to Christine and Mark before turning to them. So I really want to ask about this question of solidarity and, again, lessons learned from the Ukraine response. So Ms. Goya, you talked about this question of solidarity and the huge amount of solidarity in shaping the response in Poland, but we also saw, within the last few years, a very different response to asylum seekers arriving at the Polish border. Now, do you see, in terms of Poland's reaction, do you see this affecting your operations, the new asylum and migration law? Do you see this substantively changing, how UNHCR is approaching its work within Poland? And could you talk a little bit about what this means for you, and whether you'll be able to build on solidarity in this context.
Thank you. So as Kamal said, we don't know if that's going to be the new system, right? So I think we have to take a step back, and obviously there's a lot of analysis going on, and indeed the projects are very ambitious in terms of duration. It's true, the initial reaction from Poland to the discussions in Brussels was not, I mean, they voted against basically, so there was a clear position, but there seems to be also a bit of misunderstanding, because Poland felt unfairly that it would be unfair that they would have to pay for asylums if they don't want to contribute to the solidarity, while they have accepted on the territory 1.6 million Ukrainian refugees, to which I said the misunderstanding is that there seems to be a provision that would make an exception to countries who face already a mass influx. And I think in the case of Poland, that would be a fairly easy case to make if we were looking at the discussion within those parameters. I think for any system to work in the EU, it has to be on the foundation of responsibility and solidarity. So responsibility sharing and solidarity, by the sole fact that by geography, some countries will be more affected by irregular arrivals than others. And that's a geographical fact that we cannot do much about, but we need to take into account, obviously, the different capacities of each country. And it's true that until 2022, Poland was fairly protected from arrivals or from irregular flows of asylum seekers. So it was not really a big topic of discussion until recently. I think what's challenging for us is to have the conversation, because the legal systems are so different, right? So there is the Temporary Protection Directive for Ukrainians or for refugees from Ukraine who are giving broad protection. But if you look at I would say there's even 3 systems in Poland working at the same time, which is very challenging for us. You have the people under Temporary Protection Directive, you have asylum seekers who come regularly via the border of Poland and who have an opportunity to seek international protection, and you have those who come irregularly, and that's where the legal framework is problematic in our view and does not have all the safeguards it should have. So when discussing this, we have to look at very different provisions, very different provision within the Polish domestic system, but also how it speaks to European law. So in the end, whichever the system becomes in the EU, countries have an obligation to transpose those measures into their national systems. And countries do it sometimes with a bit of creativity or liberty, I would say. And that's the challenge, right? Because we have seen it even for the Temporary Protection Directive. Each country has transposed it a little bit differently. So on some particular technical aspect, you would have discrepancies of application of certain articles or certain protections from one country to the other, which then in the end, again, creates an issue because of the Schengen area. If something doesn't work in one country, if a country decides to have a more restrictive approach or interpretation of certain rules, then of course it very naturally, I would say, triggers a movement. So anything within the EU that is not applicable or that is not applied systematically creates a risk of onwards movement or secondary movement within the EU. So then that's a disbalance in itself that is created by, I would say, often political narratives, or at least political objectives. So, I think we have learned, the EU has learned tremendous lessons from the Temporary Protection Directive. As Petra said, it is a unique setup, and I think it has to be treated as such. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to compare this to anything else. Hopefully, we will never see such another mass displacement of that kind in the region. But so it is unique. But I think it does help to, as I was saying, even though it was a very broad, generous framework, the fact that certain provisions were applied differently from one place to another was a factor of discrepancy and potentially of movement. The fact that obviously some access to social benefits and some countries being more generous than others in the type of inclusion of social benefits, of course, plays a role one way or the other. And refugees have access to the information, have high mobility. So obviously, if there is more generosity here, then there maybe that's a factor in the decision making. Other types like accommodation that Mark said, unfortunately, it's a problem across Europe. So I don't think there's one country that is better off than another when it comes to accommodation. And it is indeed a key challenge in Poland, with no quick fixes anywhere, nothing that we can, make it happen overnight. So these are issues that need also, we need to look beyond the legal status. That's my point, is to say, we have learned that often the decision making on where to go is in dealing with the daily life. And for refugees, it's about access to labor, it's the language, it's the proximity with Ukraine, and accommodation, amongst many others. And that, I think, is the lessons learned. And if there's no EU-wide accommodation policy, and I'm not sure there will ever be, but it's definitely something that was missing in the response. So that takes us a little bit away from the legal framework, but just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
No, I think that's incredibly important, where we see the legal frameworks actually differing, on the ground, and very practical implications of this, and maybe not addressing some of the main challenges that you're seeing, in the day-to-day. And Mark, Mr. Alston, I really would like you to comment on this as well. We're talking about other countries paying countries to other countries to host refugees and asylum seekers, but some of the factors that you mentioned in terms of housing, et cetera, do we see funding as the main issue here? Do we see other challenges really being the main issue? Do you think that we'll really see a difference being made for localities in this new approach? So could you comment on this?
Yes, I can. But first of all, let me say that we as an association discussed 2 weeks ago the agreement on of the council, and we totally support it and agree with it. But like Kamal said, we will see what the European Parliament makes out of it. And we are also quite sure it won't help us in the short or midterm. Because there are a lot of open questions to be talked about, and Petra already mentioned a few, like who will run the border facilities, how will relocation work, how we can ensure that people stay in the assigned states, and like what Christine said, like how will Ukrainians count into the system. Like for Poland, that is a big issue, and that's what we heard from our border communities and cities to the Polish border actually. So concerning the topic of funding, funding is an issue. Of course, you can solve a few problems with money. That's probably true. But what we are really missing, except for accommodation, is human resources in to shape the integration on the ground. So there are people working and heading the integration courses, but also educators in daycare centers, teachers in schools, career counselors. There is a problem, and that's a problem which is not only solved by money. So it maybe help in the context of maybe building accommodations, or maybe also giving better salaries in these sectors where you have integration. But it won't solve the big. The money won't solve the big question of the need of more people in the system. And also concerning the new framework, it is important that at the end, it's not a system in which the majority of states exculpate themselves from the admission by paying money. And you all have the standing system where most of, or where the asylum seekers are concentrated in a few European states. So we believe that it is also important that if you're talking about a new asylum and migration laws on the European level, you have to talk about harmonizing procedures and also benefits. So you do other way on another way, you won't have a nearly fair system. It's probably the only way if you're taking these parts also into account to ensure equal distribution and of people within the European Union.
Yeah, and thank you, Mark. And I know Dr. Bendel does need to leave a little bit early, and I want to turn to you with a question from the audience and that we received on, you talked about the rights dimension, and there are these other issues that we're facing in terms of, as Mark mentioned, personnel, and there are stories coming of Ukrainians actually being able to serve as doctors, as nurses, because of these labor facilitation measures, actually being able to contribute and take part in solving some of these issues. And we have plenty of research on how refugees and asylum seekers can do this in other contexts, actually contribute. So could you talk a little bit about, the integration dimension and some practical policy solutions that you might see in this context?
Yes, I think if we take Germany as an example, we have a pretty liberal legislation right now with the new government, with the three-party coalition that tries even to attract migrants into our job market. And there are also job market schemes where both refugees and all the Ukrainian persons could perfectly integrate into once we open up the schemes. And this is pretty possible that this will be guaranteed in a very near future. However, it's not only about legislation. You also have to see that we have a high level of bureaucracy, that there people bring a lot of diploma and work experience, which is not being recognized very, very easily. So this is also a second part of the story. I mean, you also have to have the people in the bureaucracy. You have also to create something like a welcoming culture. And let's be honest, we don't always have that in Europe. I'm talking about my own countries, also about other countries, that what is necessary is a more welcoming, a more open culture and an easier, not so strict and not so slow bureaucracy, which is, one of the main obstacles, I think, for people who are already here. And then let's take an example. Ukrainians teachers, we need them desperately. But then in the Länder, which is education as a Länder competence, some of the Länder say, well, they have to teach two different disciplines. If they just have studied, say, German or mathematics, they have to study again from the start and learn German. How can you manage to do so? I mean, these are people we really need in the education system, and many are teachers in the university system, as people in the kindergartens, also in healthcare. People come with a lot of education, and it's not easily recognized. I think this is something we are still lacking in terms of welcoming culture.
Thank you, Dr. Bendel. And I want to, conclude on, we have a question from the audience on whether the current array of circumstances warranting asylum means, does that mean that we need a new international convention on the subject? And that's it's a broad and important question, but I'd like you to conclude with just 2 minutes of what policy actions do you recommend on this subject? Do we need a new convention, or do we need actionable measures on the ground? So Ms. Goya, I'd like to start with you on this in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes, yeah, I will just keep it short. I don't think we need a new refugee convention. I think it's as internet conventions are. It's obviously it was developed at a different time for a different situation, but it served the purpose right, I think, throughout the many years. And it's true, it doesn't foresee obviously the changes, the context we are seeing, but it's flexible enough that it has given broad protection and guidance to countries. And I think that's the most important. If you have a very specific refugee convention that, puts things into very narrow application, then it doesn't serve the purpose. So if a text continues to be applicable 70 years on, I think it's a good, it speaks for its quality. And I think that's usually the case for international law. What is needed, I think, yes, is indeed more solidarity. We haven't talked about outside of Europe, but 75%, I was looking, or 76%, sorry, of refugees in the world are hosted by low or middle income countries. And I think that's a key feature. Of course, we in Europe, we look at Europe, but Europe has capacities, has huge capacities, and has demonstrated them through the Ukraine crisis. So really the question is, how come, most of the refugees are hosted in countries that are struggling themselves? And this is really where solidarity has to be really showing. If you look, and the final word I would say, and I think Kemal alluded to that, most of the refugees not covered by temporary protection in Europe, they come from where? Syria, Afghanistan, countries that are, facing wars and unrest. And obviously, unfortunately, and that's beyond our line of work, but we need just more peace solutions. We need more conflict resolution so people can actually consider a return to their home countries, which they want to do, whether now or later. And this is really speaks for the state of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, and that gets at, an audience member posed the question of addressing root causes of conflicts instead of dealing with the after effects. And, at the same time, some of these conflicts that you mentioned, Syria, Afghanistan, they're not ending anytime soon. That people, over in the Syria case, as Kemal knows well, over 95% of Syrians surveyed don't want to go back within the next year. So Kemal, I'd like to just turn to you again on policy recommendations for EU policymakers in this case.
Just a couple of very quick points. Moving forward, I think Christine, having served in Turkey, might well agree with me. Solidarity doesn't last forever. Yes, I think Europeans have received Ukrainians with open arms. It's commendable, but we are already in polls detecting that this is falling, that solidarity element is falling, though the level is still very high. That needs to be borne in mind. A second point is that what I have seen from the discussion so far, especially from Mark as well as from Petra, is that the Ukrainians are integrating really well where they're being hosted. But there are serious consequences as far as the future of Ukraine itself goes. Because Ukraine, like many European countries, especially Western ones and Eastern ones as well, demographically is not doing well. And a large chunk of its population, because of the war, has had to leave. When we're talking about reconstructing Ukraine and foreseeing an eventual membership to the European Union, Ukraine is going to need these people to come back and participate in that reconstruction effort. That needs to be borne in mind. One very quick 2 points is that as moving forward, European Union decision makers, as they tackle this new pact on migration and asylum, need to pay a little bit more attention to what the Global Compact on Refugees is suggesting, especially in terms of the kind of countries that Christine has referred to, those countries that are hosting the largest number of refugees. In solidarity needs to be expressed in that context. Whereas embedded in those two proposals that we talked about, adopted by the European Council, embedded in that, not that discreetly, there is this element of externalization embedded. And that's why the president of the European Commission with the Italian prime minister scrambled to Tunisia right after those proposals were adopted by the council. That needs to be questioned. We cannot expect the European Union to resolve its problems by kind of transferring responsibility to countries in the immediate neighborhood of the European Union, who are already struggling with not only with their own problems, but also with becoming increasingly buffer zones for irregular migration and asylum seekers. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that important point, Kemal. And Mr. Alexander, we'll conclude with you. So practical policy recommendations from city and municipal perspective.
There was a lot of important things that Kemal said. I think if you're looking, you won't solve a refugee crisis on the local level. You just can make sure that you have a good accommodation and that you don't an integration process, and that you're welcoming the refugees on the one hand, but on the other hand, don't forget that you have people in your community in the cities and municipalities that you're not where you have the duty not to overpower them with this task. And I think if integration is a goal you are facing and you want to be fulfilled, then you have to get a system of solidarity where everybody, like in the European Union, takes a share of refugees and helps each other, so that integration in the local level all across Europe is possible. I think that would be a common goal we should face, and that not a few states in the European Union take the burden of hosting the refugees. That's my wish, my conclusion. And yeah, solidarity, I don't know how many people are watching, but if everybody does his share or her share, it helps.
Thank you all for joining this discussion, and apologies for going over. So please, I'd like to thank our panelists and stay tuned for more events coming from Brookings Foreign Policy as well. So thank you all and take care.